had always thought I could handle being alone. I was 28, freshly divorced, and I thought the answer to my mess of a life was a week alone in the wilderness. I rented a small cabin in the northern woods of Maine, somewhere outside Millinocket, in the summer of 2019. The kind of place that looks charming in pictures. Log walls, a stone chimney, a small porch, but in reality is miles from any neighbor, any real help. My plan was simple. Disappear into the quiet, maybe fish, read, drink coffee by the lake. Just a week to breathe. The first day was perfect. I drove up a narrow dirt road that twisted through dense pine forests. My old Jeep's tires kicked up dust, and the air smelled like pine resin and wet earth. I reached the cabin around noon, unloaded my gear, and walked inside. It was rustic. No Wi-Fi, no cell service, just a wood stove, a small kitchenette, a creaky bed, and windows that looked out at the forest. I unlocked the door and felt a quiet thrill, like I had a secret all to myself. That night, I sat on the porch with my dog, Baxter, a 2-year-old golden retriever I had brought along. He was curled up at my feet, tongue lolling, ears twitching at the occasional rustle in the woods. The sun set behind the mountains, and the sky turned a deep shade of orange, bleeding into violet and black. The wind rustled the trees, and I felt calm in a way I hadn't in months. I made dinner on the tiny gas stove, beans, some bread, and a small steak, and ate while listening to the distant call of loons across the lake. I went to bed early, exhausted but happy. The second day, things began to feel off. I woke around 6, brewed coffee, and decided to explore the area on foot. The forest was dense, tangled with moss and fallen branches. I walked along a trail near the cabin and noticed odd signs. Tire tracks in the dirt, though the trail was supposedly unused. Scraps of blue tarp tangled in the underbrush, and a series of footprints, larger than mine, heading deeper into the woods. I shook it off, blaming hunters or hikers. Baxter stayed close, sniffing constantly, his ears perked. That night, I started hearing noises. Not the normal creaks of a wooden cabin or the wind in the trees, but soft thumps, irregular, coming from the edge of the woods. I told myself it was deer or raccoons, maybe a bear rummaging around. Still, I couldn't sleep. I kept the doors locked, the small kitchen knife by my bed. Baxter growled once or twice, low and guttural, but then settled. I eventually drifted off, uneasy but not panicked. The third day was when I realized I wasn't imagining things. I was chopping firewood outside when I heard a branch snap behind me. Baxter immediately lunged toward the tree-line, barking furiously. I ran toward him, calling his name, and saw a figure retreat into the trees. I caught only a glimpse. Tall, wearing dark clothes, moving quickly but awkwardly, like they weren't used to the terrain. My heart raced. I grabbed my phone, but, as expected, there was no signal. I considered leaving, driving back down the dirt road into town, but something froze me in place. Curiosity, stubbornness, I don't know. I told myself I was imagining it, that the woods played tricks on the eyes. That evening, I barricaded myself in the cabin a little more than usual. I stacked chairs against the door, lit the stove, and kept Baxter close. The sounds didn't stop. Footsteps circling the cabin, soft thumps against the walls, the occasional rustle in the underbrush. I didn't sleep. I just sat back against the wall, watching the windows. Hours passed. I noticed the faint smell of smoke one time, drifting from somewhere in the woods. Not a fire at the cabin, but something else. By the fourth day, I had resigned myself to some version of survival mode. I set traps around the cabin, just makeshift ones with sticks and cans, nothing lethal, more to alert me than harm anyone. I carried the knife constantly, and I even dragged a spare chair in front of the windows, though it didn't really make me feel safer. The noises escalated. I started hearing whispers, or maybe the wind. It was hard to tell. Sometimes it sounded like words, muffled and distant. That evening, I decided to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight, Baxter on leash, and cautiously moved toward the edge of the woods. The forest seemed to press in on me, the trees so thick that even the moonlight barely pierced the canopy. I followed faint tracks in the dirt, larger than mine, and soon came upon a small clearing. That's when I saw it. A makeshift camp, hidden behind a thick wall of bushes. There were scraps of food wrappers, a burnt-out fire pit, and a tattered tent. Nothing ominous in itself, just someone had been living there, watching, maybe even watching me. My stomach sank. I backed away slowly, keeping my flashlight on the camp, and returned to the cabin. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I just sat in the corner, knife in hand, listening to the footsteps outside, imagining someone crouched in the trees, watching my every move. I began considering leaving in the middle of the night, even though I had to navigate the forest in darkness. On the 5th day, I woke to find something worse. My Jeep had been tampered with. The tires were slashed, and the driver's side door had a deep scratch across the paint. Fresh. Panic hit me fully. Whoever had been out there was bold. They had followed me close enough to do this. There was no option but to escape on foot, and even that felt like a gamble. I packed the essentials: water, food, my jacket, Baxter, and decided to head north, toward a ranger station I had noted on an old map. It was 10 miles at least through dense forest, but I had no choice. The trek was grueling. Every sound made me jump. A snapping branch, the rush of a distant stream, the howl of a coyote. Baxter stayed close, protective, growling at every shadow. At one point, I saw a figure again, far off, moving parallel to my path but never approaching. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I just moved, stumbling over roots and rocks, through thick underbrush. My legs ached, my lungs burned, but I kept going. By late afternoon, I emerged onto a gravel road. Relief hit me in waves. I saw a park ranger truck in the distance, parked at the edge of the road. I waved frantically, shouting. The ranger approached, eyes widening at my disheveled appearance and the state of Baxter, who was muddy and panting. I explained everything as quickly as I could, still catching my breath. They radioed for backup, and soon 2 more rangers arrived. We returned to the cabin with caution. When we got there, the campsite in the woods was gone. Everything packed up, leaving only faint signs of disturbance. The cabin showed no new damage, except for my Jeep, which had been further vandalized. The rangers speculated a transient living in the woods, someone used to surviving and observing. They said it wasn't uncommon in that area, but I had been dangerously close to someone who had no reason to be kind. I left the cabin that day with Baxter in the back of the ranger truck and never returned. The week I intended for peace had turned into one of the scariest experiences of my life. Looking back, the fear wasn't about monsters or ghosts. It was about someone else, entirely human, who had been so close I could feel their presence in every shadow, every sound. I realized I had underestimated how isolated and vulnerable the woods could make a person, and I've never gone on a solo wilderness trip since. The ending, though, was clear. I survived. I wasn't hurt. I made it back to civilization, to towns and lights and roads, to a sense of safety that felt almost alien after the week in the cabin. And I learned something important. Nature isn't inherently scary, but people can be terrifying, especially when you are alone and far from anyone who can help. I still remember the winter of 2018 because it was the year I decided to spend a few days away from everything and everyone. I was 31 at the time, tired of city noise, tired of my office job, and tired of being around people all the time. I thought a small trip out of town would give me a chance to clear my mind. I chose a remote area in northern Michigan near the state forest, a place I had only seen on maps and a few pictures online. Most people liked cabins with modern comforts and easy access, but I didn't have much money and I always preferred quiet places anyway. The road leading out there felt endless. It was a single-lane road with no streetlights, and as I drove, I noticed how thick the trees were on both sides. The branches looked like they were trying to reach toward the road as if they had not been cut back in many years. My car's headlights hit piles of old fallen branches and rocks on the edges of the road. The wind made a soft whistling sound, and even though it was daytime, it already felt isolated. The cabin I rented looked old in the pictures, but I expected old wood, not old decay. When I reached the property, I noticed the roof looked warped and some boards were split at the edges. There was an old metal chimney on the side that looked rusted all the way down. The front porch had broken steps, and I had to watch where I placed my feet because the wood felt soft, like it could snap under pressure. There was no caretaker around, just a key in a metal box nailed next to the door. That alone gave me a strange feeling, but I ignored it. Inside, the air felt stale, like no one had opened a window for years. Dust sat on every surface. The cabin had a single small bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a living area with a wood stove that smelled like burnt ash. I remember noticing a deep scratch in the floor near the door, like something had dragged across it a long time ago. I kept telling myself it was just old furniture being moved by whoever stayed there before me. The first day went by quietly. I took a short walk behind the cabin toward a shallow creek. The ground was covered with dead leaves, and every step made a crunching sound. I could hear nothing except the wind pushing through the trees and the occasional distant crack of branches. I enjoyed the silence at first, but later I realized there was a constant feeling that I was being watched. My mind was probably just reacting to being alone, but even then it bothered me more than I wanted to admit. That night I tried sleeping early. The bed felt old, the mattress uneven, and I could hear the cabin creak when the wind blew hard against the walls. At around midnight, I woke up suddenly. I didn't know why, but something made me open my eyes like someone touched my shoulder, even though no one was there. I listened carefully and heard a faint scraping sound outside, something moving across the wooden porch. My body froze. I stared at the ceiling and tried to control my breathing. I assumed it was an animal looking for heat near the cabin, maybe a raccoon or something similar. I forced myself to stay still until the sound faded. The next morning, curiosity got the best of me. I stepped outside and looked at the porch. There were long drag marks across the boards. At first, I thought maybe something heavy fell over, but the direction of the marks led toward the tree-line behind the cabin, as if something had been pulled into the woods. The air felt colder than the day before, even though the sky was clear. I tried convincing myself it was probably just an old board being moved by wind or maybe an animal dragging a piece of wood. I knew it didn't make much sense, but it calmed me enough to ignore it. During the day, I explored more of the woods. I found old fence pieces lying flat on the ground and a metal bucket rusted through. Deeper into the woods, maybe half a kilometer away, I found what looked like a collapsed shed. I didn't go inside because it looked unsafe, but I noticed old footprints in the mud near it, like someone had walked there not long ago. They weren't fresh enough to tell exactly when, but they weren't washed off by rain either. That evening, I started a small fire in the wood stove. The cabin still felt cold, like heat couldn't stick to the air around me. I sat in the living area reading an old magazine someone left behind years ago. As the hours went by, the wind got louder outside. I could hear branches brushing against the side of the cabin. Then, I heard what sounded like heavy steps on the porch. Slow, one at a time, like someone trying not to break the wood. I stopped breathing for a moment. I felt heat inside my chest, but cold everywhere else. I didn't move from the couch, didn't want to even blink. The steps didn't go away for a long time. I kept imagining someone standing right next to the door, listening, waiting. When the steps finally stopped, I still couldn't make myself move. I sat in the exact same position for more than half an hour, just staring at the stove, listening to my own heartbeat. At that moment, I knew something was wrong about that cabin. Something real, not supernatural, but something from actual people. I eventually stood up and quietly locked the door, even though it was already locked. Couldn't sleep at all that night. I just kept listening for any sound. I heard something fall in the woods, maybe a fallen branch. I heard scratching on one of the windows, but didn't know which one. By morning, my nerves felt tight, and my body felt weak because I barely rested. I thought about leaving, but the idea of driving that long road out of the forest made me feel unsafe too. If someone was out there, they could follow me or block the road. My phone barely had any signal, 1 bar at most. I tried texting a friend just to say everything was fine, but the message didn't go through. Later that day, I found something behind the cabin. Near the dirt path, there was a pile of clothes. They looked old, torn, maybe from a backpacker or hunter who left them behind. But there was something strange about how they were arranged. They were folded too neatly, as if someone placed them there on purpose. I didn't touch them. I felt sick just looking at them. When night came again, I felt like my brain was working against me. Every sound felt like a warning. I couldn't focus on anything except listening. Around midnight, the noise came back. This time, it wasn't steps. It was a slow, dragging noise along the side of the cabin, moving from one corner to the other. I felt every muscle in my body tense. I stayed still and tried breathing slowly, but I felt panic building. Something was definitely moving around the cabin on purpose. At some point, the dragging sound stopped near the back door. I didn't dare look. I kept telling myself to stay calm. Then I heard breathing, slow and heavy, like someone pressing their face against the wood and exhaling. That was the moment I realized I needed to leave, no matter what. As soon as daylight came, I packed my bag and got in my car. My hands shook while I started the engine. I didn't look behind the cabin again, didn't look at the porch. I just drove straight ahead toward the main road. The farther I got from the cabin, the less heavy my chest felt. It wasn't fear anymore. It was relief, like escaping something real and dangerous. When I reached town, I stopped at a gas station just to stand near people again. I remember how strange normal sounds felt. The sound of cars, voices, a radio playing inside. I stayed there for almost an hour before driving home. For weeks after returning, I kept thinking about what happened. I looked up old news around that area and found articles about missing hikers from past years. I don't know if any of that connected to what I experienced, but every time I think about those folded clothes and those dragging sounds, I know someone had been around that cabin. I never went back to a place like that, and I don't think I ever will. That trip taught me something real, something I didn't understand until I experienced it myself. It wasn't ghosts or anything supernatural. It was something much worse. It was knowing someone real was out there in the dark, watching, waiting, and maybe planning something. Even today, whenever I hear wind against my windows at night, I remember that heavy breathing outside the cabin wall. I remember lying in that bed, knowing someone was only a few steps away behind thin old wood. And I know with complete certainty that if I had stayed one more night, something very real might have happened, something that I would not be here to write about. It was late October of 1998, and I had driven for hours along the narrow, winding roads of northern Vermont to reach my uncle's cabin. The rain had started sometime around mid-afternoon, a cold, steady drizzle that had turned into a hard, relentless downpour by the time I pulled up the gravel driveway. I was 26, a bit worn down by city life in Boston, and I had hoped that a quiet weekend in the woods would help me clear my head. I didn't expect it to turn into one of the most unsettling nights of my life. The cabin was old, built sometime in the 1960s, I think, with weathered cedar siding that had turned a dull gray. The roof sagged in the middle slightly, and the windows rattled when the wind blew through the trees. I could smell the dampness before I even opened the door, a mixture of wet pine needles, decaying leaves, and that particular mustiness that only old cabins carry. I dropped my bag by the threshold and switched on the small oil lamp that hung by the door. The warm glow barely penetrated the dimness inside. I went straight to the kitchen to light the stove. The cabin didn't have electricity. It ran entirely on propane for cooking and a small generator that only powered a couple of lights. The stove hissed and sputtered as I managed to get it lit, the small flame illuminating the cramped kitchen. Rain hammered against the metal roof, a sharp, steady drumbeat that made it impossible to ignore the isolation of the place. I felt it immediately, the sense of being completely cut off from the world. There was no road nearby, no neighbors within miles, and the forest surrounding the cabin seemed denser in the rain, darker, like it was closing in around me. After getting a pot of water to boil for tea, I decided to check the rest of the cabin. The living area had a worn couch and a couple of chairs, all covered in faded, threadbare fabric. There were shelves lined with dusty books, mostly old outdoor guides and a few tattered novels. I noticed a thick layer of dust on everything, as if the cabin had been neglected for months at a time. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and every sound seemed louder than it should have been. Even the wind outside sounded unnatural, rattling the windows and making the trees groan in protest. I tried to distract myself by unpacking my bag and arranging a few things. The rain outside seemed to grow heavier with each passing hour, the kind of rain that saturates the earth until the forest floor becomes a sponge. Thunder rolled in the distance, though it never struck close. At first, it was soothing, but after a while, it started to feel oppressive. Shadows from the flickering lamp danced across the walls, exaggerating the crooked angles of the old cabin. I realized that every small noise, the drip of water through a leaky spot in the roof, the groan of the floor under my weight, was amplified in the silence. By late evening, I decided to light the small fireplace. I gathered a few logs from the stacked pile by the cabin wall and arranged them carefully. The first spark caught, then another, and soon the fire was roaring. The warmth was a relief, but the shadows it cast made the cabin feel even stranger. Every corner seemed to harbor some movement, and I caught myself glancing over my shoulder more than once, half expecting to see something out of place. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, that the isolation and the storm were playing tricks on me. As the night deepened, the storm intensified. Rain pounded the roof and sheets of water ran down the windows. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, and the branches scratched and thumped against the cabin. I noticed something odd out of the corner of my eye, a movement in the forest. At first, I thought it was just a branch falling, but it didn't feel right. The movement was deliberate, quick, and low to the ground, like someone or something was moving between the trees. My pulse quickened. I reminded myself there were hunters in the area, or perhaps deer or raccoons, but the motion was too controlled, too calculated. I tried to focus on keeping warm, sitting closer to the fire and sipping my tea, but my eyes kept darting to the windows. The forest seemed alive, and the rain made it impossible to see clearly. Every so often, I caught glimpses of dark shapes weaving between the trees. Then came the sound that made my stomach drop, a low, almost methodical crunching, like footsteps on wet leaves and twigs, moving in a pattern. It wasn't random. Whoever it was, they were circling the cabin. My heart started pounding, but I forced myself to stay calm. I remembered my uncle's advice. If you ever feel alone out there, make yourself as big and visible as possible and don't hide. Someone coming close might think twice. I grabbed a flashlight, the heavy-duty kind that could almost pass as a small spotlight, and stood by the window, shining it through the rain. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the nearest trees. Nothing, but I knew I had seen movement before. I thought about calling the sheriff, but my cell phone had no signal. The nearest town was at least 15 miles away, through winding roads that would take at least 40 minutes to reach, even without the storm. Minutes dragged on, each one stretching longer than the last. I listened to the steps circling the cabin, always staying in the background, never getting too close but never leaving. The fear started gnawing at me from the inside, a sharp, physical tension that made it hard to breathe. I tried to rationalize it, maybe an animal, maybe a lost hiker, but nothing explained the precision of the footsteps. They weren't random, they were purposeful, watching, waiting. I decided I couldn't just sit there. I grabbed a hatchet from the rack by the door, a standard tool, but in that moment it felt like my only protection. I opened the cabin door just a crack and shone the flashlight into the darkness. Rain soaked me instantly, but I didn't care. I could see tracks in the soft mud. Heavy boots, large and deliberate, circling the cabin again and again. Whoever had been out there had left them, and they weren't going anywhere. Then, almost suddenly, the footsteps stopped. The rain seemed to quiet slightly, though the wind still rattled the trees. I could hear nothing except the patter of water on the roof. The silence was worse than the noise. It pressed down on me, filled with a sense of being watched. I waited for what felt like hours, flashlight in hand, eyes scanning every shadow. Then I saw it. A dark figure, crouched behind a tree a few dozen feet away, staring straight at the cabin. I froze, heart hammering. The figure stayed there, silent, until a flash of lightning illuminated it completely. A tall man, wearing a soaked jacket and boots, his face partially obscured by a hood. He moved after the lightning, disappearing back into the black forest. I didn't follow. I didn't move. I just stood there, rain soaking my clothes, waiting for what felt like forever until I finally decided to retreat inside and lock the door. I spent the rest of the night pacing the cabin, checking every window, every corner, gripping the hatchet. Morning came slowly, with gray light filtering through the clouds. The storm had passed, leaving everything soaked and misty. The forest looked calm, peaceful even, but I knew what I had seen. I left the cabin immediately after eating a quick breakfast of canned soup, driving as fast as I could on the slick roads toward the nearest town. When I got there, I called my uncle, who told me later that there had been reports of a missing hunter in the area who liked to stalk cabins for food and supplies. He was found days later, and it explained everything: the footsteps, the figure, the circling. Even now, years later, I can remember that night clearly. The isolation, the storm, the constant feeling of being watched. It never left me. But I also remember the relief of getting back to safety, the clarity of knowing it was a real, tangible danger, and the importance of preparation and caution in the wilderness. That night didn't have ghosts or monsters, just a very real, very human threat. But it changed the way I look at the woods forever. I remember that summer of 2012 like it happened yesterday. I was 23, and my younger brother, Ryan, had just turned 19. We decided to take a short trip to a remote cabin my uncle owned in the northern part of Idaho, far from the roads and the nearest town. The cabin had been in the family for decades, tucked into a dense patch of pine and fir trees, surrounded by steep hills and a river that wound its way like a silver ribbon through the valley below. My uncle warned us that the area could be dangerous, but Ryan and I didn't care. We wanted isolation, the kind of solitude where you could hear nothing but the wind in the trees and your own heartbeat. The first day was perfect. The drive up the winding roads took hours, passing nothing but the occasional logging truck and the occasional abandoned shack that looked older than anything we had ever seen. When we finally arrived, the cabin was exactly as I remembered from childhood visits. 2 stories, dark weathered wood, and a porch that creaked like it had a life of its own. The windows were dusty, and the paint had long since peeled off, but it had character. The smell of old wood, pine sap, and the faint odor of smoke greeted us as we opened the door. I unloaded the car while Ryan explored the surrounding woods. As night fell, the cabin felt small and almost cozy. We lit a fire in the stone fireplace, and the shadows danced along the walls, giving the room a strange warmth. Outside, the wind was picking up, whistling through the trees, and I could hear the river rushing in the distance. Ryan was quiet, unusual for him, but I assumed he was just enjoying the peace. Around midnight, I woke to a strange noise. At first, I thought it was the wind, but there was a rhythm to it, like someone walking carefully across the deck. I froze, listening. The steps stopped suddenly, and then there was silence. I waited, heart thudding, straining to hear anything over the crackling of the fire. Then I heard it again, softer this time and closer, like someone brushing against the outside wall. I nudged Ryan, who groaned and rolled over, ignoring me. I slipped out of bed, careful not to make a sound, and grabbed the hunting knife I had brought. I moved to the window and peered out into the darkness. The porch was empty. My eyes adjusted slowly, and I scanned the surrounding trees. Nothing. Then I noticed a shadow, far off among the trees, moving. It was too deliberate to be an animal. My stomach sank. I called Ryan again, louder this time, but still he didn't respond. My first thought was that it was someone messing with us. Perhaps locals who didn't like strangers, but the nearest town was over an hour away. Whoever this was, they had hiked into the woods to reach us. I decided to step outside quietly, hoping to get a better look. The moment my boots hit the wooden porch, I realized something was wrong. The back door, which I was sure I had locked, was slightly ajar. My heart raced. I moved silently, gripping the knife tight, every sense on high alert. The shadow I had seen earlier was gone. Then I heard it, a faint scraping sound, like claws or something being dragged across wood. I ran back inside and grabbed Ryan, shaking him awake. Finally, he stirred, groggy and confused. I explained what I had seen and heard, but he just shrugged, half asleep, not taking it seriously. I wanted to believe him, but instinct told me something was wrong. The rest of the night was unbearable. I stayed awake, listening. Around 2 a.m., I heard footsteps again, this time on the roof. Heavy, deliberate, like someone was pacing. I realized then that it wasn't just the wind. Whoever or whatever was out there knew we were alone. My mind raced through scenarios. Robbers, crazed hunters, someone hiding in the woods watching us. I wanted to call for help, but there was no cell service. We were completely cut off. By dawn, the noise had stopped. We both stayed huddled near the fireplace, sipping coffee and staring out the window at the dense forest. That morning, I decided we needed to search the cabin and surrounding area for signs of intruders. We went outside cautiously. The back door was still slightly open, and there were small footprints in the soft dirt leading away from the cabin into the forest. They were human, small, not like a full-grown adult. We followed them for a few hundred meters, but eventually lost them in the dense underbrush. The forest seemed endless, and every snapping twig made me jump. We returned to the cabin, shaken but determined to stay calm. The next night was worse. Around 11 p.m., we heard heavy breathing outside the cabin. Ryan and I stayed in the living room with the lights off, listening. Then the sound of the door handle rattling. Whoever it was tried to open the door, twisting the knob slowly. I held the knife ready, every muscle tensed. Then suddenly the noise stopped. Silence. Too much silence. We didn't sleep that night. Instead, we waited for the first light, every hour feeling like an eternity. Morning came, and I decided we needed to leave immediately. I packed as fast as I could, and Ryan helped, still half in shock. Just as we were loading the last of our things into the car, I saw movement among the trees. A figure standing completely still, watching us from the tree line. When I blinked, it was gone. We didn't stop driving until we reached a small town over an hour away. I called the sheriff and reported what had happened. They came out the next day, searched the area, and found nothing. No footprints, no signs of forced entry, nothing. They said it might have been a prankster, someone hiding in the woods, but it didn't make sense. The way it moved, the way it watched, it didn't seem like someone just looking to scare. It felt patient, calculating. It was weeks before I could even think about the cabin without feeling my chest tighten. Ryan refused to go back, and honestly, neither did I. My uncle ended up renting it out for hunters, but I never went near it again. What stayed with me wasn't just fear. It was the knowledge that someone had been there, right on the edge of our lives, invisible and silent, with enough patience to wait for the perfect moment to make us notice them. And yet, despite everything, we survived. We left, we locked the doors behind us, and we drove away, leaving that cabin and the forest and whoever or whatever was lurking there behind us. Years later, I still think about it sometimes, especially when I'm alone in a quiet place. I know the forest is full of people who could do things like that. The idea of someone hiding, watching, waiting is far scarier than any ghost story. That summer, Ryan and I learned how fragile a sense of safety can be, and how quickly it can vanish when someone chooses to step into your world unnoticed. Even now, I can picture that cabin, the dark wood, the shadows moving just beyond the porch, and the sound of someone breathing softly outside. And I know we were lucky because, unlike so many others, we made it out, and we knew enough to never go back. It was the fall of 2018 when my college friend, Jason, and I decided to take a weekend hunting trip in the backwoods of northern Michigan. We were both 21, exhausted from classes and exams, and thought it would be the perfect break. Just the two of us, a small cabin we rented from a local outfitter, and miles of forest to explore. We arrived late Friday afternoon, the sun already dipping behind the thick pine trees, casting long shadows across the narrow dirt road that led to the cabin. The cabin itself was small and rustic, built from rough-hewn logs, with a tin roof that had begun to rust in patches. A stone chimney jutted from one corner, and a thin wisp of smoke curled upward, probably left over from the last tenant. The windows were grimy, the kind that made the inside look darker than it actually was. As soon as we parked my old Toyota near the edge of the property, I felt the first flicker of unease. The forest around us was quiet, too quiet, except for the occasional snap of a twig underfoot or the distant caw of a crow. We unpacked our hunting gear quickly, 2 rifles, extra ammo, and our cold weather clothing, then went inside the cabin. The floorboards creaked under our boots. Dust coated the furniture, and the air smelled faintly of mold and old wood. A single bare light bulb hung from the ceiling. I noticed the windows were all intact, but the glass had a few cracks, and the door didn't shut smoothly. It was the kind of place that felt abandoned even though it was technically rented. Saturday morning, we woke early, just as the sky began to glow with pale light. The temperature had dropped overnight, and frost coated the edges of the cabin windows. Jason was already up, peering through binoculars at the tree line. We had decided to split our hunting route. He would take the ridge trail to the east, and I would follow a creek bed to the west. It was risky to separate in such isolated territory, but we both thought we were cautious enough. The forest was thick, the ground uneven with roots and fallen branches. My boots sank slightly in the damp soil as I made my way along the creek. The only sounds were the occasional drip of water from the tree branches and the squelch of wet leaves beneath my feet. I kept my rifle slung across my shoulder, scanning constantly for deer or any movement. Hours passed, and I hadn't seen much. A rabbit darted across the path at one point, and later a fox, its red fur bright against the gray moss. The quiet was oppressive, and I realized I hadn't heard a single other human sound since leaving the cabin. By early afternoon, I decided to head back. I was about a mile from the cabin when I noticed something odd: footprints in the mud. They weren't deer prints, nor did they look like any normal animal. They were human, larger than mine, but they weren't familiar. I followed them cautiously, keeping my rifle raised. The tracks twisted away from the main trail and led deeper into a part of the forest I hadn't planned to explore. Something about them made my stomach tighten. They were too deliberate, too spaced out, as if someone had been watching. I debated turning back, but curiosity overpowered caution. The deeper I went, the denser the forest became, and the light dimmed as the sun began to lower. Shadows stretched long and twisted among the trees. Then I heard it, a snapping sound, like a branch breaking behind me. I froze, straining to listen. Nothing followed immediately, but the hair on my neck stood on end. I started moving again, faster this time, trying to convince myself it was just the wind. I almost tripped over a fallen log and landed hard on my hands. My rifle hit the ground with a dull thud, and when I picked it up, I noticed a movement in the shadows. A figure, maybe a man, crouched at the edge of the trees. My heart jumped. I raised my rifle instinctively, but as I focused, the figure vanished. Panic set in, and I realized I had no idea which direction led back to the cabin. I started running blindly, branches slapping against my face and arms, mud sucking at my boots. The footprints I had been following were still ahead, now more numerous, as if someone or multiple people had been moving alongside me all this time. The forest seemed to close in around me, and every shadow looked like a threat. I heard another snap, then a rustle, just to my right. My pulse raced. I didn't look. I couldn't afford to. I just ran. Eventually, I stumbled into a small clearing and saw the roof of the cabin in the distance. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. The door to the cabin was wide open, swinging slightly in the wind, even though I was sure Jason had closed it that morning. My stomach sank. I approached cautiously, rifle raised, scanning every corner. Inside, the cabin was in disarray. Drawers pulled out, scattered papers, a chair knocked over. Jason's backpack lay on the floor, torn open. My mind raced. He wasn't here. Whoever had done this hadn't been subtle. I checked the surrounding area. Footprints circled the cabin, some heading into the woods and others fading toward a back trail I hadn't noticed before. My first thought was to find Jason, but there was no time. Whoever had been here might still be close. I grabbed my gear and ran to the nearest road I knew existed, hoping to flag down a passing car. It took over an hour, and I was soaked, cold, and exhausted. The sun was near the horizon. When I finally reached a wider path, I saw headlights coming down the road. I waved frantically, and a truck slowed. The driver, a man in his 50s, stopped, letting me in. I told him about the cabin and that my friend might still be inside. He nodded grimly and radioed for help. Within the hour, a local ranger team arrived. They secured the cabin and began a search for Jason. Jason was found later that evening, several miles deeper into the forest, disoriented but unharmed. He explained that while he had been on the ridge trail, he had seen strange figures watching him from the tree line. He had tried to hide and ended up lost, wandering until he stumbled onto a Forest Service path. Whoever had been at the cabin had left without harming him, but their presence had been terrifyingly close. We never learned who had been at the cabin. The footprints didn't match anyone in the local database, and there was no sign of forced entry into other cabins in the area. After that weekend, Jason and I never returned to northern Michigan. We sold the hunting gear we had brought, and every time we talked about that trip, the silence between us carried more weight than the words. Looking back, the forest didn't feel like it was alive in a supernatural way. It felt like it had eyes. Every sound, every shadow had a reason. We had thought we were careful, but isolation changes your perception, makes small noises enormous, and distant movements terrifying. That weekend left a mark on both of us, a lesson in respecting the wilderness. Not just the trees and animals, but the people who could be out there, watching, moving silently, waiting. I never hunted alone again, and I never underestimated the quiet, because I had learned that in the wrong place, at the wrong time, even silence can be dangerous. It was the winter of 2017, one of those cold, gray mornings in Cumbria that made the air feel sharp and heavy, like it would cut right through your lungs if you breathed too deeply. I had been driving for hours along narrow, winding roads, the kind that twisted through forests so dense that even at midday, shadows clung stubbornly to the ground. My plan was simple: a weekend alone, away from the city chaos of Manchester. I needed silence and a place to think. I found the cabin online, a small, old wooden structure just off a rarely used lane near the edge of a frozen lake. It promised isolation, a bit of charm, and the kind of quiet that city life never allowed. When I first arrived, the cabin looked exactly as described in the listing. A dark brown timber building, slightly sagging in the middle, with a steep roof covered in moss and a narrow chimney that had long since stopped puffing smoke. The air smelled of wet leaves and wood smoke, the forest pressing in from all sides. I parked my car on a small gravel patch and stepped out, my boots crunching against frost-hardened leaves. The silence was oppressive at first, heavy, but comforting in its own way. I unpacked quickly, my mind still buzzing from the drive, and decided to explore the surrounding woods before night fell. The forest was dense, the kind where branches tangled together like fingers, letting in little light. I walked down a narrow trail, my dog, Baxter, trotting silently beside me, his paws making muffled thuds against the frosty ground. After about 30 minutes, I stopped near a small clearing. The lake was half frozen, its surface dull and gray under the cloudy sky. And that's when I saw her. She was standing at the far end of the clearing, just at the edge of the frozen lake. At first, I thought she might be another visitor, someone who had rented a cabin too. But the way she stood was wrong. Her clothes were old and ragged, a dark coat that looked water-stained and muddy, boots caked with grime. Her hair hung wet and stringy over her face, and I could see her staring directly at me, not just noticing me, staring. Her eyes were dark, alert, and completely unblinking, and the cold wind made her coat flap around her in unnatural folds. I felt a prickle run down my spine. I called out a greeting, half out of politeness, half out of curiosity. She didn't move, didn't flinch. I tried again, louder this time, and that's when she tilted her head slightly, like she was examining me, and then turned and disappeared into the woods without a sound. I waited, heart thudding, thinking maybe I had imagined it, but Baxter growled low in his throat, ears pinned back, fur bristling along his spine. I didn't follow her, not then. Instead, I slowly walked back to the cabin, telling myself it was probably someone who lived nearby, perhaps a homeless woman, and that I had no reason to worry. The rest of the afternoon passed without incident. I chopped firewood, lit the old stove, and made tea, trying to push the image of her out of my mind. By nightfall, the wind had picked up, rattling the window panes and the forest noises, branches snapping under unseen weight, distant animal calls, made me uneasy. I double-checked the locks on the cabin doors, feeling an irrational need for security. Around 10 in the evening, I let Baxter out into the small yard to relieve himself. That's when I saw her again, just at the edge of the forest, standing silently under the faint light of the moon. My heart jumped. She wasn't moving. Her dark coat blended with the trees, but her face was unmistakable. I could see the sharp angles of her cheekbones, the hollow look in her eyes. And then, suddenly, she raised her hand, just a small wave. Not a friendly one, not at all. It was deliberate in a way that made my stomach twist. I pulled Baxter inside, slammed the door, and locked it. The night was long. Every sound, an animal moving in the underbrush, the wind against the cabin walls, made me tense. I kept checking the windows, seeing her figure occasionally, just beyond the trees, standing motionless, watching. I didn't sleep. I just sat near the stove, watching shadows grow and shrink with the flickering firelight. The next morning, I knew I had to leave. My unease had turned into fear, rational or not. I packed quickly, checking every corner of the cabin before I went. As I loaded my car, I thought I had seen the last of her. Then, just as I started the engine, I saw movement in the woods across the road from the cabin. She was walking slowly, deliberately, toward the edge of the gravel path, as if she had been following me since the night before. I froze, gripping the steering wheel. Baxter growled again. I decided not to confront her. I put the car in gear and drove slowly past the forest, watching the tree line, my pulse hammering. She didn't move, just stopped and stared as I passed. It was unsettling. How calm she was, how she seemed completely at home in the frozen forest while I felt like a trapped animal. I drove for an hour before I let myself relax slightly, turning onto a busier road. I eventually made it to a small village, stopping at a petrol station to collect my thoughts. I spoke to the attendant casually, asking about the cabins in the area. That's when I learned something that sent a chill straight down my spine. The cabin I had stayed in hadn't been officially rented out in years. Some locals still visited occasionally, but the owner had long since abandoned it. And more than that, a woman matching the description I had seen had been spotted in the woods multiple times over the past several years. She had never harmed anyone, but her presence was unnerving, a lingering shadow on the frozen lake and among the trees. Took me weeks to shake the feeling. I couldn't get her out of my mind. The dark eyes, the ragged coat, the way she seemed to belong in that abandoned, frozen place while I felt like an intruder. I returned to Manchester eventually, and though I told no one about the full details, I kept thinking about her whenever I was alone, in empty streets or quiet parks. Years later, I learned that she lived on the edge of the forest, surviving off the land, almost entirely cut off from society. She had no intention of harming anyone, and yet the way she existed, silently watching, had a presence so intense that it left a mark on anyone who stumbled into her territory. It made me realize that not all fear comes from danger. Sometimes, fear comes simply from witnessing someone who doesn't belong in our world, or from realizing how fragile the boundaries between normal life and the unknown really are. I never returned to that cabin, but I never forgot that winter either. The image of her, the way she stood by the frozen lake, perfectly still, watching, remains vivid in my mind. And now, whenever I walk through forests or along isolated roads, I always glance at the edges, half expecting to see her, half hoping I won't. Because some encounters don't need violence or malice to haunt you. Sometimes the presence of another person, existing in a way that defies everything you understand, is enough to make you feel like the world is suddenly much colder and darker than you ever imagined. I remember the first night I drove up to Lena's cabin after everything changed. Lena was my wife's older sister, After my wife passed away in 2022, nothing felt real anymore. The world looked dull and heavy, and I tried to keep myself busy with work, but every place inside our house reminded me of her. I felt trapped inside my own thoughts, and every object around me felt like it carried her voice even though the house was silent all the time. Lena told me to come stay for some days at her cabin in the northern part of Idaho, far away from the noise of the city. She said the quiet and the cold air might calm me. I agreed because I could not stay in my home any longer. The cabin was about 3 hours away from the nearest town, surrounded by thick pine trees that seemed to grow closer to the dirt road every year. It was early October. The air smelled like wet leaves, and the sky looked gray before evening even started. When I reached the cabin, the sky was already turning darker, and a weak shade of orange tried to stay alive behind the clouds. It was the kind of cold that felt like it touched the bones even though winter had not fully arrived. Lena had been living there alone for a long time. She was quiet ever since her sister passed. I think we were both trying to deal with the same heavy feeling in different ways. She spent most of her days hiking or fixing small things around the cabin. I tried to help, but I felt slow and heavy. The first night, I barely slept. I kept waking up, feeling like I was supposed to hear my wife's breathing, but instead the cabin was filled with thick silence that almost felt louder than noise. The cabin was old, built sometime in the 1970s. The wood walls smelled like old dust and dried pine. There were small scratches and marks on the inside logs, like someone dragged furniture around for years. There were pictures of old mountains and a river on the walls, and the floor had a soft, weak sound every time someone stepped, like the wood was tired from holding weight for such a long time. The windows were single pane, and even the slightest wind made them shake. On the third day, I told myself I needed fresh air. I took a long walk around the woods behind the cabin. I followed an old narrow path that looked like it had been used years ago and then forgotten. The sky stayed gray the entire time. The woods were dense, and the further I walked, the more silent everything became. I could hear my own steps on the dead pine needles, and every now and then, a sound from a branch breaking somewhere far away made me look around. I remember touching some of the trees as if I needed to make sure I was still there and not lost inside my own head. A little further down, I found an old shed I never knew existed. It looked abandoned, barely standing, as if the forest was slowly swallowing it. The door was crooked, and the roof had a visible bend. I walked around it slowly, unsure if I should even open it, but something inside me made me curious. The door made a dry creaking sound when I pushed it, and the smell of old damp wood came out first. Inside, there were rusted tools, some broken fishing rods, and cardboard boxes with dark water stains spreading across them. In the corner, I noticed a pile of old blankets thrown on top of something. When I pulled them a little, I noticed old plastic containers and empty cans. It confused me because they did not look decades old. They looked like someone might have used them recently. The dust on them was thin, not thick. I tried to tell myself maybe Lena stored stuff here, but something about it felt off, like the shed wasn't meant to be touched anymore. When I walked back to the cabin, the woods felt darker. The clouds covered nearly all the remaining daylight, and everything looked shadowed. I felt my heartbeat going a little faster, even though there was no real reason. I kept looking behind me, convinced something was moving between the trees, but every time I stopped, everything looked still again. That night, I barely slept again. I tried to keep my eyes closed, but every small sound made my mind wake up. The cabin made all sorts of noises in the dark, like the wood was stretching. I kept thinking about the shed and why the containers looked recent. I felt something uneasy growing inside me. The next day, Lena went into town early for supplies. I stayed behind, planning to clean the small storage room near the back door of the cabin. While cleaning, I heard something outside, like light footsteps on the side of the cabin. I stopped and listened, The sound was soft, slow, almost cautious. I waited, but it went silent. I tried to convince myself it was probably just deer walking near the wall, but the steps felt too close to the cabin, almost like something walked right beside the wooden wall. Later, I went outside to check, and that's when I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. In the mud near the side of the cabin, there were footprints. Not animal ones, human, bare human feet. I just stared at them, trying to understand. They were small, but clearly adult. The mud pattern looked fresh, maybe less than a day old. A trail of them led toward the woods, the same direction as the old shed. Everything inside me felt cold and tense. I did not know what to think or how to react. I told myself maybe Lena walked out at night, but the prints looked too small compared to her size. I followed the prints slowly until they disappeared around thick brush. I stood there, looking deep into the woods, feeling watched even though I saw nothing. When Lena returned, I never mentioned the footprints. I felt strange bringing it up. I tried to ignore it and spent the evening reading one of her old hiking books, but my mind kept going back to that trail. Around midnight, I woke up again. This time I felt something, not heard something, like someone was inside the cabin or near it. I could feel it in my chest. I slowly got out of bed, walked to the small window and looked outside. At first I saw nothing but darkness, but after staring long enough, my eyes adjusted. That's when I saw a shape near the tree line, a human figure standing very still, facing the cabin. I froze completely. I stared at it without blinking. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, almost blending into the dark. Felt like time stopped. I wanted to believe it was just my mind trying to see things that were not there, but I knew what I saw was real because the shape was solid. After what felt like a long time, the person slowly stepped back into the trees and disappeared behind them. I barely slept after that. In the morning, my hands were shaking when I tried to make coffee. I felt like something terrible was close to happening. I walked around outside again, and sure enough, the same barefoot prints were in the mud again, this time even closer to the cabin door. By evening, I made a decision. I could not stay another night. I waited until Lena returned and told her I needed to leave in the morning. I did not give details. The night felt heavier than all the nights before, almost like the air was aware of my decision. Before sunrise, I packed my things. The forest was dark and quiet, but something inside it felt awake. As I loaded the car, I noticed fresh footprints again, leading away from the cabin this time, toward the old shed. I looked at the trees one last time and felt the same cold feeling inside my chest, like invisible eyes were staring from between the branches. When I drove away, I checked my mirror again and again. The cabin slowly disappeared between the trees, and I felt relief slowly settle inside me. I knew I made the right choice. I never returned to that cabin, and Lena eventually moved closer to town. Some months later, she admitted she sometimes felt someone watching her through the windows late at night, but she didn't want to scare me while I was there. I still think about those footprints and the person standing in the dark staring at the cabin. I will never know who it was or what they wanted, but I learned something important. Not every scary thing comes from stories or imagination. Some fear comes from real people who hide in places where they are not supposed to be, watching quietly, waiting for reasons we might never understand. Every time I remember those nights, I feel grateful I decided to leave before anything worse happened, and I am certain that cabin was not a safe place after dark. It was the winter of 1998 when I decided to drive up to the mountains alone. I was 26 at the time, tired of city noise and crowds, and I needed a few days to myself. I had rented a small cabin in a remote part of northern Vermont, a place I had found in an old travel magazine. The cabin was supposed to be simple, a single room with a fireplace, a small kitchen, and a lofted sleeping area, but I liked that. Isolation felt safe in a way that the city never did. The drive up was slow. Snow had started the night before, and now the roads were slick with a thin layer of ice covered by fresh rain. The sky was a flat gray, heavy with clouds, and the wind whipped at the bare trees lining the road. My car struggled over the small hills, and every turn revealed a darker patch of forest. By the time I arrived, night had fully settled. The rain came in sheets, the kind that makes you think twice about leaving a warm car. The cabin sat at the end of a narrow dirt road, tucked into a shallow valley. Its windows were dark, and the wood was weathered and gray. The porch sagged slightly in the middle, and the door handle was cold and damp when I pushed it open. Inside, the air smelled faintly of mildew and old wood. I dropped my bag and built a small fire in the stone fireplace. The flames flickered across the walls, casting long shadows that trembled with the wind outside. I made a pot of coffee and watched the rain hit the windows, a constant, hypnotic patter that filled the silence. By 10 o'clock, the rain was relentless. I had unpacked the essentials: my sleeping bag, extra blankets, and a small lantern. The cabin didn't have electricity beyond a single generator that only worked sporadically, so I relied on candles and the fireplace for light. The storm outside had picked up. The wind bent the trees at sharp angles, and I could hear branches snapping in the distance. It was the kind of storm that makes every little sound inside feel louder. I tried to read, but the pages kept slipping in my damp hands. Eventually, I gave up and went to the loft, wrapping myself in blankets. The rain on the roof sounded like a drum, constant and heavy, and the occasional sharp crash of a branch against the cabin made me sit up. I didn't sleep well that night. Around 2 a.m., I woke to the sound of the front door creaking. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I heard it again, slow and deliberate. I froze, straining to hear over the rain. My heart was hammering, my pulse in my ears. I grabbed the lantern from the floor and climbed down the narrow stairs, each step creaking under my weight. The door wasn't open, but there were wet footprints on the wooden porch, fresh ones. I swallowed hard and told myself it had to be an animal. Deer sometimes wandered close, or maybe a stray dog, but the prints didn't look like anything I recognized. They were human-sized, leading from the edge of the forest to the cabin and stopping at the door. I checked the windows. They were all closed and locked from the inside. Still, the feeling of being watched settled into my chest. I went back upstairs, tried to tell myself it was nothing, and eventually drifted back into an uneasy sleep. Morning came with gray light breaking through the clouds. The storm had calmed, leaving only a steady drizzle. I wrapped myself in a coat and went outside to inspect the porch. The footprints were gone. Nothing but wet marks from the rain on the wood. I told myself I must have imagined it. Still, the feeling lingered, the sense that someone had been close just outside, and I hadn't noticed until it was too late. I decided to stay inside most of the day, lighting the fireplace, reading, and trying to ignore the creeping tension. Around 3 in the afternoon, I heard a low sound from the woods, like something large moving through wet leaves and broken branches. It wasn't fast, just slow, deliberate steps. I stood at the window, straining to see through the rain. The trees swayed, the wind carried the sound, but I couldn't see anything clearly. I thought about calling for help, but there was no cell service. My only option was to wait it out, stay inside, and hope whatever it was would leave. Night came again, darker and heavier than the last. I kept the fire going, burning everything I could find in the fireplace to keep the cabin warm. Around 11, I heard it again, the creaking at the door. This time I didn't wait. I grabbed the old hunting knife I kept for emergencies and slowly stepped toward the door. The wind was blowing from the northeast now, carrying the smell of wet earth and pine. I listened, trying to catch any sound. Then I heard it, a soft scraping, like someone trying to move the latch. My hands shook, and I could feel my breath in my chest. I flicked on the small battery lantern. The light barely reached the porch, but I could see movement. A figure, hunched and soaked from the rain, was standing at the edge of the porch. I froze. The figure didn't move toward me or run. It just stood there, shaking slightly, watching. My mind raced. This was not an animal. This was a person. My first instinct was fear, but then I noticed something else. The figure was clearly exhausted, soaked, and weak. The rain had plastered their clothes to their body, and they seemed more lost than threatening. I hesitated for a moment, then opened the door a crack. The figure flinched but didn't move. I stayed behind the door, keeping the knife ready. Slowly, the person spoke, just a whisper, but it was enough to tell they were human. They had been stranded, lost in the storm, and had wandered until they found the cabin. They were shivering violently, teeth chattering. I stepped aside and let them in, closing the door against the wind and rain. I wrapped them in blankets and set them by the fire. They couldn't talk much, just nodded and shivered. I brought them coffee and dry socks. Slowly, their breathing evened out, and they stopped shaking as violently. They were a young man, not much older than me, lost from a hiking trip that had gone wrong when the storm hit. He had no way to get back, and the rain had soaked him to the bone. We stayed up the rest of the night by the fire, him wrapped in blankets, me watching the storm through the windows. The fear I had felt before melted into concern. By morning, the rain had stopped completely. The sun came out weakly through gray clouds, glinting off the wet trees. We found a small ranger station a few miles down the road. He was able to get help, call for a ride, and arrange for a safe return. I stayed behind at the cabin, exhausted but relieved. The storm had left the forest washed and quiet, the kind of silence that feels heavy but safe. That night, alone again, I reflected on how quickly fear can turn into something else. Care, responsibility, even compassion. The cabin that had felt like a trap during the storm now felt like a sanctuary. The wood smelled dry and warm from the fire, the floor creaked under my boots, and the rain no longer hammered against the windows. I had faced the unknown and realized that sometimes the scariest part isn't the darkness outside, but what it can reveal about ourselves. By the next morning, I packed up and drove back to the city. The road slick but manageable under a pale winter sun. The memory of that night stayed with me. The rain, the storm, the footprints, and the man I had saved without a word. It reminded me that fear doesn't always end badly, and that the world, even in its most chaotic moments, can still offer clarity and unexpected grace. It was the summer of 2008 when I first went to visit my uncle's farm in rural Vermont. I was 19 at the time, freshly done with my first year of college, and I thought a week on a farm, away from the city, would be relaxing. My uncle, Hank, had this old property that had been in the family for generations. It wasn't a huge farm, just a few dozen acres of overgrown fields, a barn, and an old cabin near the woods. The cabin had been empty for years, and my uncle used it mostly for storing old tools and supplies, though he insisted it was still safe to stay in if needed. I drove up in my beat-up sedan along a narrow dirt road that twisted through the forest. The air smelled like pine and damp earth, and the sun was low, slanting across the hills as I finally reached the farm. My uncle met me at the edge of the driveway. He was in his late 50s then, tall, with sun-leathered skin and hands rough from decades of labor. He didn't say much, he rarely did, but he gave me a nod and gestured toward the cabin. "You can sleep there if you want. Just keep your stuff in the main house if you're worried." I thanked him and unloaded my bag, thinking it would be fun to have my own little space for the week. The cabin was smaller than I expected. It had 2 rooms, a tiny kitchen with a cracked sink, and a sleeping loft that smelled faintly of old wood and mildew. The windows were grimy, letting in just enough light to see the dust motes floating in the air. I decided to clean it a little, sweeping the floor and airing it out through the one window that actually opened. By the time I finished, the sun was setting, painting the sky in dark oranges and purples. That night, I went to sleep in the loft with the door propped open. The sounds of the farm were different at night. Rustling in the barn, the occasional hoot of an owl, the distant bark of a dog. I woke up around 2 in the morning, though, because something felt off. The air felt colder, heavier somehow, and I could hear faint noises that didn't belong. At first, I thought it was the wind rattling the cabin, but the more I listened, the more I realized the noises were coming from outside. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching through the gravel driveway and the dry leaves of the trees. I froze, straining to listen. The steps stopped for a moment, then continued, closer this time. I could hear the faint scrape of something metal against stone, like someone was dragging a tool. I didn't dare move or make a sound. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I remembered my uncle's warning about not wandering into the woods after dark. But this wasn't the woods. This was right outside the cabin. Eventually, the sounds moved past the cabin and faded into the distance. I stayed awake the rest of the night, too alert to sleep, listening to the distant night sounds, every snap of a twig making me flinch. The next morning, I found marks in the dirt outside the cabin. Footprints, big ones. They didn't look like animal tracks, at least not completely. They were irregular, as if someone had been wearing old work boots and dragging their feet. I didn't tell my uncle. He had that way of shrugging off odd things, saying the farm had its own rhythm, its own secrets. I tried to put it out of my mind, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Each day, I tried to keep busy, helping with feeding the chickens, pulling weeds, fixing fences, but every sound made me pause. The creak of the barn doors, the snap of a branch, even the wind through the trees sounded deliberate, like someone was following me. On the third night, I was in the cabin again, sitting on the worn wooden floor and jotting down some notes in my journal when I heard a loud bang against the side of the cabin. I jumped up, my heart in my throat. Something heavy had hit the wood. I grabbed the old flashlight I kept by my bag and crept to the window. Outside, the moon was dim, just enough to see shapes. A shadow moved along the tree-line, tall, bulky, moving with a careful slowness. My stomach dropped. I thought about calling the police, but my phone had no signal. I thought about running to my uncle, but even the walk to the main house would take me through open land, and I had no idea if whoever it was could see me. I stayed in the cabin, flashlight in hand, waiting. The shadow didn't come closer that night, but I didn't sleep again. By morning, I found more evidence of someone or something being there. A rake had been moved, one of the old barrels overturned. It was clear someone had been inside the perimeter of the cabin, maybe even closer than I realized. My mind raced with possibilities. Thieves, drifters, someone scouting the property. But the thought that unsettled me most was how deliberate it all seemed. Whoever it was knew the layout, knew where to stay out of sight. The next few days were tense. I avoided the woods entirely, stayed close to the cabin, and kept watch whenever I could. On the 5th night, I heard the steps again, slow and heavy, coming up from the creek that ran behind the property. I peered through the cracked window just in time to see a figure crouching near the edge of the forest, staring toward the cabin. It was impossible to make out features in the darkness, but it was human-sized, wearing a dark jacket, moving without hesitation. That night, I finally made my plan. I would leave at first light, before anyone could see me. I packed everything quickly, quietly, and kept the car keys in my hand as I moved to the edge of the field. The air was cold against my skin, and I kept my eyes on the tree-line. As I approached the car, I saw it. footprints leading from the forest directly toward the cabin, fresh and deep in the dirt. My stomach churned, but I didn't look back. I got into the car, locked the doors, and drove down the narrow dirt road as fast as I dared. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station 20 miles down the road, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the wheel. I called my uncle from there, explained that I had to leave. He didn't seem surprised. "The farm has its own ways," he said. "You did good to get out." I asked if he'd seen anyone around the cabin, and he said no, but I could tell he didn't want to talk about it. I never went back to that cabin. Years later, I asked my uncle if anyone had ever trespassed there. He finally told me that a couple of vagrants had been living rough in the woods behind the property that summer. They were desperate and sometimes dangerous, moving quietly to avoid the main house. He'd suspected them near the cabin but never caught them. Even now, 15 years later, I can still feel the weight of that week. The constant awareness, the small sounds that made my chest tighten, the cold fear of being watched. I don't know if I was lucky or careful, but leaving when I did probably saved me from more than just a scare. That old cabin was never the same to me after that, and I've never spent another night alone on a farm since. I remember the drive like it was yesterday. It was the fall of 2007, and I had decided to take a week off from my job in Albuquerque. I wanted to clear my head and escape the city, so I rented a small, isolated cabin deep in the Lincoln National Forest. I was 28, single, and always a little too curious for my own good. I had my old Labrador, Max, with me. He was 15, slow, and gray around the muzzle, but still alert and sharp when it counted. The cabin itself was nothing fancy. It was a wooden structure built in the 1960s, slightly leaning to one side, with a rusted tin roof and a chimney that looked like it hadn't been swept in decades. A dirt path led to it from the main road, surrounded by dense trees that blocked out almost all sunlight once you were inside. The isolation was exactly what I wanted, but it came with an uneasy silence that settled into your bones. The first night, I unpacked my things, set up a small fire in the fireplace, and fed Max. The wind howled outside, and the trees scraped against the walls in a way that sounded almost like scratching. I kept telling myself it was just the cabin settling, or the wind, or the branches hitting the windows. Max didn't seem bothered. He lay by the fire, occasionally lifting his head to glance at the shadows. The second night, I was reading a book in the dim light when I first noticed the sound. It wasn't outside the cabin but around it, outside my small clearing in the denser forest. Low, guttural sounds, almost like someone trying to imitate a growl but failing. Max's ears perked up, and he growled softly. I froze, telling myself it was a coyote or maybe a raccoon. But then I heard something else, the snapping of twigs. Something was moving closer. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped onto the small porch. The air was crisp, smelling of wet leaves and wood smoke from some distant cabin. I shined the light across the clearing, but all I saw were the silhouettes of the trees. Nothing moved. Max was stiff at my side, his hackles raised. That night, I slept with the flashlight within reach, Max curled up against me, ears twitching at every sound. By the third day, I realized something was wrong. I'd gone for a hike down a trail behind the cabin, and I came across fresh tracks. Too large for a dog, too uneven for a deer. They were human-like but wrong, almost distorted. My stomach sank. I didn't see anything that day, but Max refused to leave my side and growled at every rustle of leaves. The fourth night was the worst. I woke up around 2 a.m. to Max barking, low and tense. I turned over and saw a shadow moving at the edge of the clearing. I froze, barely breathing, listening. The shadow didn't run. It didn't move like a person either. It was wrong. Its movements were stiff, awkward, like it was learning to mimic a human walk. My heart hammered in my chest. I reached for my old hunting rifle, the one I brought just in case. Max stood, hackles raised, growling. The shadow stopped moving, then stepped back into the woods. I spent the next day reinforcing the cabin as best I could. I blocked windows with spare wood, made sure the doors were locked, and carried a flashlight everywhere. I stayed on edge, barely eating, barely sleeping. The woods outside seemed alive, watching, moving. That night, I decided to sleep fully clothed, rifle by the bed, Max at my feet. It was around 3 a.m. when I heard it again. This time, it was inside the clearing, just beyond the line of firelight from the cabin. I saw a figure crouching behind a tree, then another, and they started moving. They weren't running, they were walking deliberately, slowly. One of them stepped out from behind a tree. My stomach dropped. It looked almost human, but wrong. The head was too big, the arms too long. Its skin seemed stretched over its body in an unnatural way, and its face, though partially hidden, was twisted, almost like someone wearing a mask of flesh. Max leapt at the figure with a fierce bark. It recoiled but didn't run. Instead, it froze for a second, then dropped to all fours and vanished into the forest. My blood ran cold. I grabbed my rifle, loaded it, and spent the rest of the night listening to the snapping of branches, knowing it was still out there. By the 5th day, I was trapped in a routine of fear. I didn't leave the cabin. I didn't go near the windows. Max refused to eat anything I put down, staring at the treeline constantly. Then I found the footprints again, closer to the cabin this time. They circled the back porch and disappeared under the steps. Whoever or whatever was out there was studying me. That night, I decided I couldn't wait any longer. I would have to leave or I might not get the chance. I packed my car as quietly as possible, keeping Max close. Around midnight, I saw it again, emerging from the darkness of the trees. This time, it didn't run. It just stood there, tall, impossibly thin, watching me with something that didn't belong in a human gaze. My hands were shaking as I started the car. Max growled low in his throat, his body rigid. I drove off the dirt path as fast as I could, headlights cutting through the dark, ears straining for any sound. Behind me, I thought I saw movement between the trees, something keeping pace with the car. I didn't stop until I hit the main road and saw another vehicle's headlights. Only then did I realize I was shaking uncontrollably, Max panting in relief beside me. I never went back to the cabin. I reported it to the local authorities, but there was nothing they could do. No tracks, no signs, nothing. They looked at me like I was crazy, but Max never forgot. For weeks after, he would growl at the dark corners of the yard, ears pinned back, refusing to enter the shadows. Years later, I read a local report of hikers finding a strange carcass in the forest, too deformed to identify properly. The description sent chills down my spine. It could have been that creature, or one like it. I still wonder what it was, and if it was still out there, waiting for someone else to stumble into its forest. Even now, every time I hear branches snap outside my window at night, I feel that same fear, the realization that something can mimic humanity, study it and stalk it, and no one would believe you until it's too late. It was the summer of 2018 when I decided to take a break from the endless city noise and rent a small cabin near the edge of the Amazon rainforest in northern Brazil. I wasn't alone. I had my dog, Yago, a scruffy black and tan shepherd mix with sharp instincts and a loud bark that could scare off almost anything. I was 32, burned out from years of office work, and craving nothing more than silence, humidity, and the smell of wet earth after a heavy rain. The cabin was small, wooden, and isolated. Only a dirt path led to it, winding through thick jungle so dense that sunlight barely touched the ground. The owner had warned me to bring supplies. Stores were hours away, and communication was unreliable. I laughed it off at first, thinking how remote could possibly be dangerous. But the moment I stepped onto the porch, the oppressive green canopy around me and the chorus of insects made me realize just how far from civilization I truly was. The first day passed uneventfully. Yago explored the surrounding trees, sniffing every inch of the undergrowth, while I set up the cabin. The windows had no screens, so the smell of wet leaves and the constant drip of condensation filled the air. At night, the rainforest became alive in a way that was hard to explain. Clicks, croaks, and distant rustling that seemed almost like footsteps. But with Yago curled at my feet, I felt safe. The second day, around midday, the rain began. At first, it was just a drizzle, the kind that made the leaves glisten and the mud slick underfoot. By evening, it had turned into a torrent. I watched from the porch as water ran in small streams along the forest floor. The trees swayed heavily, and branches snapped in the wind. Yago refused to leave my side, growling at the darkness beyond the cabin. It was during that storm that I first noticed something unusual. A series of footprints in the mud, large and spaced far apart, leading from the river to the edge of the cabin's clearing. They weren't human, not entirely. They were long, the toes almost clawed, and each step sank deep into the wet soil. My heart began to pound. I called for Yago, who immediately tensed, ears forward and hackles raised. He barked low, a warning rumble that vibrated through the wooden floors. I wanted to dismiss it as some strange animal, maybe a jaguar or a tapir, but the prints weren't familiar, and they stopped abruptly a few feet from the porch. The rain made everything worse. The sound of water masking movements, the way shadows shifted, the smell of wet earth mixing with something else, something faint but pungent, metallic. I tried to focus on keeping calm, securing the doors and windows as best as I could, though the cabin was old and creaky. Every gust of wind sounded like someone walking across the porch. Yago refused to sit still, pacing near the entrance and letting out short, sharp barks whenever a branch scraped the roof. Night fell like a curtain. I lit the small kerosene lamp I'd brought, the yellow light barely penetrating the heavy darkness outside. Every noise was amplified. The rustle of leaves, the snap of twigs, the occasional splash from the river. Then came the heavy thud 2-3 times against the side of the cabin. I froze. Yago's growl became a full-throated bark, loud and unwavering, but it wasn't enough to make the noise stop. I grabbed the machete I'd packed, the only weapon I had, and crept toward the source. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the mud was thick and slippery, each step leaving a deep mark. The footprints from earlier were still there, leading toward the trees again. I followed them cautiously, Yago at my side, his body tense and ready. The prints disappeared into a small clearing near the riverbank. I stopped, heart in my throat. That's when I noticed it. Something large moving through the shadows. Not fast, but deliberate, careful, watching. For hours, I stayed near the cabin, refusing to leave, listening. The storm subsided, but the forest did not calm. The animal, or whatever it was, circulated the clearing, sometimes visible as a dark shape, sometimes hidden in the trees. Yago never left my side. He growled constantly, eyes bright and fixed on the shadows. Couldn't sleep. The rain had stopped, but the air was thick with humidity and tension. I thought about trying to hike back to civilization, but the path was slick, the footprints still there, and something deep in my gut warned me it would be a mistake. By dawn, exhaustion had taken over. I had dozed in fits and starts, always with one eye open, machete in hand. When the first weak sunlight filtered through the canopy, the forest looked almost peaceful again, but the prints were gone. Whatever had visited me in the night was gone, too. I inspected the surrounding trees and clearing, noting the broken branches, the disturbed mud, and the faint smell that lingered. I didn't try to identify it, Some part of me knew I didn't want to. The next day, I stayed vigilant. I reinforced the windows, set traps around the cabin, and made a signal fire ready just in case. Yago was restless, but obedient, following me everywhere, ears perked and tail low. When night fell again, it was quieter, though I could feel the forest around me, watching, waiting. I didn't sleep much, but I survived the night without incident. On the third morning, I packed enough supplies to leave. The sun had burned off the mist, and the forest, though alive with birds and insects, seemed less menacing in daylight. Yago sniffed the air constantly, ears twitching, but did not growl. I followed the muddy path back to the main road, careful not to lose the trail. The prints of that first night had vanished, but the memory stayed with me. By the time I reached the small town where I could call for transport, I was covered in scratches, mud, and sweat, but safe. Yago leapt into the back of the pickup, exhausted but alert. Looking back at the jungle from the road, I realized how small and fragile we had been in that immense, indifferent wilderness. Whatever had approached the cabin that night, it was gone. But it had reminded me that the rainforest is not friendly, not to anyone, not even to someone with a dog and a machete. In the weeks that followed, I replayed the nights in the cabin over and over in my head, each detail sharper than the last. The smell, the darkness, Yago's growls. I never returned to that part of the Amazon, but I knew, deep down, that it wasn't a figment of my imagination. Whatever had circled my cabin in the dark, it had been real, and it had been patient. I had survived because of preparation, caution, and the unshakable instincts of a dog who refused to let anything close without a fight. Years later, when people asked about that trip, I described it as a rough adventure in the jungle, leaving out the fear and the darkness I had felt. But I kept Yago by my side through every camping trip afterward, knowing he was more than a companion. He was a protector, a guide, and in that long night in 2018, my only lifeline against the unknown. I remember the drive clearly. It was the spring of 2019, and I had decided to take a break from the city for a few days. My plan was simple: rent a small cabin in the deep woods of northern Michigan, spend some time alone with my dog, Max, and escape the constant noise of work and life. I had picked the place randomly from a website listing isolated cabins, and the photos made it look perfect. Small, rustic, surrounded by trees, with a creek running nearby. I didn't think much beyond that. The drive started in the late afternoon. The sun was low, golden and hazy, casting long shadows across the fields and patches of forest along the highway. Max, my golden retriever, was in the back seat, leaning his head out the window, ears flapping in the wind. He was excited, sensing something different about the day. I didn't notice at first, but as the miles ticked by and the highway narrowed into old, cracked two-lane roads, a strange unease began to creep in. The GPS kept recalculating, leading me through narrower and narrower roads, past abandoned farmhouses with peeling paint, overgrown gardens, and rusted tractors that looked like they had been sitting there for decades. At one point, I passed a no trespassing sign that was half covered by vines. I shrugged it off, assuming the cabin would be just ahead, but it never seemed to appear. The road twisted, and the trees thickened, so that the sun disappeared behind the canopy long before the actual sunset. By the time I spotted the cabin, it was almost dusk. I parked on the gravel driveway, and Max jumped out immediately, sniffing everything around him. The cabin was small, made of rough, dark wood, with a porch that sagged slightly in the middle. The windows were dusty but clear enough to see that the interior was mostly empty, except for a table, a few chairs, and a fireplace. A small stack of firewood sat against the wall. The smell of damp earth and pine was heavy in the air. I opened the cabin door and was greeted by a quiet stillness that felt almost alive. It wasn't a good kind of quiet. It was the kind that makes your skin crawl if you let it sit too long. I set down my bag and tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just the isolation getting to me. I built a fire in the fireplace. Max curled up on the rug near it, and I made myself some instant coffee. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, and every once in a while, I thought I heard something moving, branches snapping, leaves crunching. But when I looked, nothing was there. The first night passed slowly. I kept the fire going and Max alert, his ears twitching at every sound. Around 2 in the morning, I was woken by a low, dragging sound outside. It wasn't a typical animal, more like something heavy scraping across the dirt and gravel of the driveway. My heart raced. I stayed as still as I could, listening. The sound stopped abruptly after a few moments, and I told myself it must have been a deer or some other animal. Sleep came reluctantly. The next morning, I went outside to explore a little. The forest was thick, the kind where you could walk for hours and see nothing but trees, moss, and the occasional fallen log. Max ran ahead but stayed within sight. I walked along the creek, noticing old footprints in the mud. They didn't look like animal tracks, they were too large and human-shaped. I frowned and followed them back toward the cabin, feeling a little uneasy. The tracks stopped at the edge of the porch. I didn't think much of it at first, assuming someone else had walked by recently. But then I noticed something I hadn't seen the day before. The padlock on the small shed at the back of the cabin was broken, and the door swung slightly in the wind. I didn't go inside. My gut told me not to. I spent the day trying to keep busy, splitting some of the firewood, cleaning the cabin, taking Max on short walks, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The isolation I had wanted now felt suffocating. That night, I decided to lock all the doors and windows, double-checking each one. I left the lights on inside, something I normally wouldn't do. Max lay at my feet, restless. Around midnight, the noise started again. This time it was louder, more deliberate. Something dragging against the side of the cabin, stopping and starting, moving around the structure. Max growled low in his throat, his hackles raised.
He sat frozen, listening.
After what felt like hours, the sounds finally stopped. I convinced myself to sleep, though my eyes stayed half open. The next morning, I found scratches on the wood siding near the back door, deep and fresh. Something had been there overnight. I didn't panic immediately, but I packed a bag quickly, deciding to leave as soon as possible. Max seemed to sense the urgency, circling and whining lightly. I drove away without looking back, the gravel crunching under my tires as I left the winding forest road behind. It wasn't until later, when I was safely back in town and stopped at a gas station, that I realized the cabin wasn't on any map. The road signs I had followed didn't exist, and when I called the rental company, no one there had ever heard of the cabin I had stayed in. It was as if the place had never existed, at least officially. The police couldn't help much. They took my statement but said there was nothing on record. I never went back, and I never tried to find the cabin again. But the experience changed me. I learned to trust my instincts, to notice the small things that don't feel right. I kept Max with me for years after that. He was my silent guardian, always alert, always watching. The odd thing is, even though it was terrifying at the time, the memory of that cabin is vivid in a strange, almost detailed way. I can still feel the rough wood of the porch under my hands, the smell of damp pine in the air, the sound of branches snapping in the dark. It's a memory that keeps me cautious, but also strangely alive. I realize that sometimes danger isn't about monsters or ghosts. It's about real things, real people, and real places that feel completely ordinary until something goes wrong. In the end, I made it home safely, and nothing ever followed me. The cabin remained a mystery, a sharp reminder that isolation can be as frightening as any imagined horror. I don't know who else had been there, or why the shed was broken, or what had made those noises, but I know I survived, and sometimes that's enough. I keep a small fire going whenever I'm alone now, and Max is always at my side. Because in the deep woods, you never know what's listening, waiting just beyond the edge of sight. It was late October of 2017, and I had just turned 27. I was driving my old, beat-up Ford Ranger along a narrow country road that stretched for miles through the hills outside of Cedar Hollow, a place I'd visited a few times in the past when I wanted to get away from the city chaos. My plan was simple: spend the weekend at a small, isolated cabin I'd rented through a local listing. I had packed my gear the night before: sleeping bag, flashlight, canned food, and enough water to last a couple of days. My dog, a golden retriever named Max, rode shotgun, his head resting lazily against the passenger seat window. The engine hummed steadily beneath me, but the road was rough and full of patches of gravel and fallen leaves that made driving tense. The sun had already dipped below the horizon when I turned onto a narrower lane, a dirt track lined with thick forest. The last vestiges of light flickered weakly through the skeletal branches, making shadows dance across the ground. There were no streetlights, no signs of civilization, just the occasional broken fence or abandoned farmhouse that seemed frozen in time. Max occasionally raised his head, sniffing the cold air and letting out a low, soft growl whenever a rustle came from the trees. About an hour into the drive, I noticed the headlights of my truck catching something odd on the side of the road. A man, or what looked like a man, was standing there, motionless. At first, I thought he might be a hitchhiker, but the closer I drove, the stranger it felt. He wasn't moving, not even blinking, and his clothes looked tattered and muddy. I slowed the truck, gripping the steering wheel tighter. There was something unsettling about the way he stood there, unnaturally still, almost like a statue. Max's hackles raised, and he let out a low, sharp bark. I decided to keep driving, not wanting to stop and risk whatever this was. The road became worse, and my headlights barely illuminated the path ahead. Large roots and rocks jutted out from the dirt, forcing me to swerve carefully. Every mile felt longer than the last. I was used to country roads, but this one seemed endless, winding deeper into the woods. Occasionally, I glimpsed glimpses of the sky between the trees. The moon was almost full, casting pale silver light that barely helped with visibility, but made the shadows of the trees stretch like fingers across the road. Then, without warning, my truck's engine sputtered. The sound of metal grinding and the shuddering of the vehicle made my stomach drop. I slammed the gear into neutral and tried to start it again. Nothing. My heart started to race. I pulled over to the side as much as the narrow road allowed, the truck leaning slightly into the mud at the edge. I could feel Max tense next to me, his eyes wide and ears perked. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was probably something simple. A spark plug, maybe fuel, but the fear creeping up my spine told me otherwise. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the truck, the cold wind biting through my jacket. The trees surrounded me like a wall, and the only sounds were the rustling leaves and Max's low growls. I opened the hood and inspected the engine, but everything seemed normal. At least nothing that I could fix without proper tools. My phone had no signal, no bars, nothing. I realized then that if I wanted help, I'd have to walk, and that thought made me uneasy. Walking alone through this forest at night was a terrifying prospect, especially with Max, the only other living being nearby. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, and decided to check the road ahead to see if there was any sign of another house or a place to get help. I grabbed a small bag with my essentials and told Max to stay. He followed closely, his tail low, sniffing the air like he could sense the tension in mine. Every few steps, I turned the flashlight toward the road, and my stomach sank each time I saw nothing but twisted trees and fallen leaves. After walking for what felt like an eternity, I finally spotted a faint light in the distance. Relief washed over me, but it was tempered by unease. The light flickered, like a candle swaying in the wind, but it was definitely human-made. My legs ached, but I pushed forward, hoping it was a house or some kind of cabin. As I got closer, I realized it was an old wooden cabin, small and clearly not used often. The paint was peeling and the windows were grimy, but the light came from inside. I could see shadows moving behind the curtains. My relief was immediate, but my caution stayed. Something about the way the cabin sat in the clearing, isolated, made my stomach tighten. I knocked on the door lightly. No answer. I tried again, harder this time, but still nothing. Max whimpered at my side. I noticed the front door wasn't locked. Slowly, I pushed it open, expecting it to creak loudly. It did, and the sound seemed deafening in the otherwise silent forest. The cabin smelled of damp wood and old smoke, the kind of smell that sticks in your clothes. There was a small fireplace, cold and empty, and a kitchen that hadn't been used in years. I walked cautiously to the back of the cabin, checking windows and corners. Everything seemed normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, had been here recently. I found a small shed behind the cabin. Inside, there was a set of tools and some firewood. At least I thought if I could get the truck going, I might have a chance to get out before morning. I returned to the cabin and decided to rest a little while Max explored the yard. I sat on the floor, leaning against the wall, and tried to calm down. Every crack of a branch outside made me jump. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the cabin, and I felt a creeping sense of dread. Hours passed. I tried to sleep but kept waking at the smallest noise. Finally, before dawn, I heard the faint sound of a vehicle engine in the distance. My heart leapt. I rushed outside with Max, scanning the road. A truck appeared, headlights cutting through the fog that had settled in the clearing. I waved frantically. The driver slowed and stopped when he saw me, and relief flooded me like warm water. I ran toward him, shouting over the engine, and climbed into the passenger seat without thinking. He was a local heading to a nearby farm. I explained my situation quickly, trying not to leave out details. He listened, nodding, and assured me I wasn't the first person to get stranded on that road. Apparently, the truck had likely run out of fuel, and it was a common problem because the route was long and isolated. He even offered to tow my truck back to his property and let me fix it before heading home. By the time the sun rose fully, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, I was sitting back on a smooth, paved road, breathing normally for the first time in hours. Max had settled in the passenger seat, exhausted. I looked back at the forest, the dirt road, and the cabin disappearing behind the trees, realizing how close I had come to being stranded there all night. I promised myself that I would never drive that road after dark again. The experience left a lingering unease, but it also gave me a strange sense of gratitude. I had been cautious enough to survive, but it reminded me how unforgiving the countryside could be. Driving back home, I made a mental note to stick to well-lit roads and reliable routes, and Max rested his head on my lap, tired but safe. By the time we reached the city, the events of the night felt like a distant memory, but I knew the feeling of isolation, the darkness, and the unknown would stay with me forever. It was late October 2003, and I had been assigned to a small ranger station in the northern stretches of the Cascade Mountains. I was 28 at the time, still relatively new in my role but past the rookie stage. My shift started at dusk that day, a cool wind carrying the scent of damp pine through the air. The forest around our station, which had been quiet and untouched for weeks, suddenly felt heavier somehow, as if the dark was pressing in closer. The call came in just as the last traces of sunlight vanished. A hiker had reported something odd near an old logging trail, something that didn't move. We were a small team, only 3 of us on duty that night. Me, Jensen, a wiry man in his 40s with a decade of experience in search and rescue, and Marlo, younger, sharp-eyed, and quick with a radio. The dispatcher gave us coordinates near an abandoned cop cabin, a structure built decades ago for forest patrols, long since left to rot. It was about a 20-minute drive on a rough dirt road, then another half-hour hike into the thickest parts of the forest. By the time we reached the cabin, the moon was a pale circle behind drifting clouds. Rain had started, light at first, pattering against our jackets, then heavier, soaking through the thin fabric and running down the folds of our sleeves. The forest was alive with sounds. The hiss of rain through leaves, distant cracks of snapping branches, and the occasional grunt of some unseen animal. The cabin came into view suddenly, a squat, sagging structure barely holding itself upright. Its windows were broken, the wooden frame dark and warped from years of neglect. I remember the smell first, the sour, metallic tang of something decayed. Jensen raised his flashlight slowly, the beam cutting through the rain, illuminating the front porch. There, partially covered by wet leaves and debris, was the body. It was a man, mid-30s, lying face down, one arm twisted beneath him. His clothes were torn, mud and blood matted into the fabric. At first, I thought he might still be alive, but the lack of movement, the pale tone of his skin under the flashlight told a different story. Marlo checked for a pulse, a quick, practiced motion, then shook his head. We moved carefully. The area around the cabin was uneven, littered with old tools, broken boards, and rusty nails. I slipped once, my boots sinking into soft mud, the cold creeping up my legs. Jensen muttered something under his breath about fools getting careless out here, but no one laughed. We needed to document everything, both for evidence and to understand how this man had ended up in the middle of nowhere. The first thing we noticed was the lack of obvious struggle beyond the obvious injuries. The body had bruises, scrapes, and cuts consistent with a fall, or perhaps a fight, but there were no signs of a prolonged struggle. The cabin itself had been ransacked long ago. The table inside was overturned, drawers open and empty, a thin layer of dust covering everything. Yet near the body, the ground was freshly disturbed, tracks in the mud suggesting he had been moved or dragged. I crouched down beside him, my gloves wet and slipping on the mud. There was a notebook clutched in one hand, soaked and barely legible. Pages stuck together, but some words could be made out. Found chasing? Don't trust, never call. The writing was jagged, rushed, terrified. It was impossible to know exactly what had happened, but fear had been present in his last moments. That much was clear. Marlo started photographing everything, circling the cabin and the body, documenting every detail. Jensen marked points on a map, noting tracks leading into the trees and toward a shallow ravine to the east. The forest seemed to swallow every sound except the rain and the occasional distant howl of a coyote. My stomach tightened as I realized just how isolated we were. Even in the light of our flashlights, shadows seemed to cling to the trees, stretching and shifting with every movement. We stayed there for hours, moving methodically. The body had to be secured, evidence collected, and the area recorded before the coroner could arrive. By the time we began dragging him toward the ranger truck, the rain had turned to a steady downpour, soaking everything. My jacket clung to me, my boots squelching with every step. The mud threatened to swallow our footing, and I slipped more than once, my hands raw from gripping branches and the wet, heavy body. Once back at the truck, we covered him with a tarp and drove the rough, winding trail back to the main road. The engine's hum and the windshield wipers' constant swish felt like a small comfort after the oppressive silence of the forest. Jensen drove, his hands steady on the wheel despite the rain, while Marlowe relayed coordinates and details to dispatch. I sat in the back, staring at the tarp, trying not to think about the notebook or what the man had been running from, or who had done this to him. By the time we reached the county coroner's office, it was nearly 2 a.m. The rain had not let up. The building was bright and sterile, a shocking contrast to the dark, wet wilderness we had left behind. The coroner, a tall woman with a calm, professional air, took the body and began her initial assessment. She made notes quickly, asking a few questions, though mostly she worked silently. She confirmed blunt force trauma along with some deeper cuts consistent with some kind of weapon, though it would take further examination to be certain. We filed our report slowly, deliberately, detailing every observation. What stood out most to me wasn't the body itself, but the silence we returned to after leaving the forest. Even the constant rain couldn't wash away the feeling that something was missing. Not just the man, but the answers. Who had done this? Why here in this abandoned cabin in the middle of nowhere? The notebook was sent with the body, hopefully to reveal more than we could. Weeks later, after we had returned to routine patrols and the forest had gone quiet again, the coroner's office confirmed it. The man had been the victim of a random act of violence, the sort that could happen anywhere if the right or wrong circumstances aligned. There was no conspiracy, no creature, no hidden force. Just human cruelty, cold and brutal, and the forest as a silent witness. It changed how I approached every hike and every patrol. I learned to respect the isolation, to trust my instincts, and to remember that even in the most remote, beautiful places, danger could be human, patient, and terrifyingly ordinary. That night, with the rain drumming against the truck roof and the cabin disappearing into memory, I understood the weight of that truth. Even years later, I remember the smell of wet pine mixed with iron, the slick mud under my boots, the notebook clutched in a dead man's hand. It wasn't a story of the supernatural or the unknown. It was a story of reality, and reality, I realized, was often more frightening than any legend. The forest doesn't forgive, doesn't forget, and it keeps its secrets in silence. One of which we finally had to carry with us, back into the world of light, warmth, and routine that felt so distant after that night.